Chapter 40. Our Chinese friends Agnes and Alan Chanye lived next door and attended school with us at St. Agnes's Convent. Their house had been constructed of bamboo and wood over one of the bombed-out houses around ours. Their mother brokered the sale of jewelry, and their proximity to our house made it convenient for my mother to carry out the transactions over the garden fence when she found herself in a position where she had to sell her jewelry. We sometimes found our way into the Chinese shop, which stood on the side street off the main road. The owner would stand facing us across a long, narrow counter, which was laden with jars of exotic knickknacks, each with a unique, tantalizing flavor of its own. Our particular favorite was sangandi. These salted, dried plums with wrinkled flesh made our mouths water just to think about them, as did the deep red preserved ginger, which had a sweet, pungent, lemony taste. The wall behind the storekeeper was lined with shelves, which held a strange assortment of jars, bottles, and small packages wrapped in shiny green, yellow, red, and gold paper. Our eyes would, however, only focus on the large glass jars on the counter. The parents of two other Chinese students at the convent, Peter and Nancy Kwan, owned a shop which took up one corner of the crossroads by the marketplace, and was at that central point where the old banyan tree stood, its roots exposed at the base, encircled by a low concrete wall, its branches radiating outwards and spreading wide, enticing stray dogs to come and lie in its shade. The store contained miscellaneous articles, but specialized in the sale of spectacles, which the townsfolk came in and tried on. If they could see better through the lens, they bought the glasses irrespective of the fit, so that there were some people in the town whose glasses kept slipping off because the frames were too large for their faces, and others with frames too small so that they left indentations on the bridges of their noses or pinched the skin above their ears. Further down the road was a Chinese restaurant where Po Sain, who caught the thief who stole our bag of flour, but we never visited it, and it was more like a truck stop where bus drivers and their helpers picked up passengers wishing to travel to towns and villages beyond Kalor. We often heard the bus driver's assistants calling out loudly, "Ang ban shui niao taunji go! Ang ban shui niao taunji go!" This signified the direction they were heading and the stops along the way. I moved swiftly into that time and place, and I am there again, where the market sits in the heart of Kalor, but lies asleep for 4 days, deserted, its stalls empty, except for stray mangy dogs sniffing at old scents and hoping for a bone from the butcher's shop that remains open every day. The butcher, probably of either Pathan or North Indian descent, stands behind a large table-sized chopping board which seems to be too high, but not for his tall stature. The most striking thing about him is the color of his eyes, which are green with hazel flecks in them. He has sharp features that are accentuated by his bronze tanned skin, and his manner is pleasant and helpful as he neatly slices large chunks from the remains of the carcass of a goat suspended from a large metal hook in the ceiling. The walls are entirely covered in shiny, sterile, white tile, contrasting sharply with the redness of the meat and the odor of mutton that hangs in the air. Looking down on the market square from a slight elevation was the hospital, a small one-story building generally manned by one doctor and a couple of nurses. A little room in the front of the building was where the compounder mixed his various healing agents and passed them out to the patients via a small window like the one in a box office. The medicines I became familiar with and which were kept on the ready at home for first aid on us were red mercurochrome and zambuk ointment for bruised knees, iodine tincture for sore throats, and a cough mixture that had a strange medicinal taste, and also Vicks that felt cold and clammy when rubbed on the chest for coughs. Castor oil, that obnoxious laxative, was available in a large bottle at the Shirazi store, and once in a while was served on a spoon with lemon juice and sugar by parents who judiciously preserved their children's health by cleaning out their system for fear of tapeworms. We would squirm as the smell of the oil reached our nostrils, and gag as the thick oil reached our throats, and then go through the pangs of stomach cramps and diarrhea for the remainder of the day. Fortunately, this was not a frequent punishment we were put through, because all it seemed to do was leave us feeling weak. I didn't mind the mercurochrome on my regularly scraped knees because it felt cool when it was applied, and the red color spread beyond the outer edges of the bruise, creating a fine rainbow-colored border, exaggerating the size of the wound and thereby generating more sympathy. There were many doctors who came through Kalor, each staying for a year or two and then moving on. Dr. Paul lived at the top of the hill on the road that led past our front gates. He was a short, slightly plump Bengali gentleman, probably a bachelor because we never saw his wife. His repertoire of medicine became suspect, as far as I was concerned, because on one occasion, on a mischievous impulse, I had put my hand out to him, exposing my palm, which was covered with faint splotches of fading henna that had been applied a few weeks earlier, and said, "Look at my hand, why is it like this?" And he looked at it carefully and said, "I think you have cramps." "Aha, yes, that's what it is." I withdrew my hand and looked at him, amazed at how easily I had tricked him. But now that I think of it, the trickster was probably the one who ended up being tricked. We also had another Bengali physician, Dr. Ghosh, who lived in a house on Pagoda Hill. He was slender of build, relatively tall, and carried a well-rounded abdomen that protruded incongruously in front of him like a football. He had a pleasant disposition and smiled regularly, with his upper lip slipping back over his buck teeth. The cause of his good humor and his physique could have been his pleasant wife, who spoke Hindi with a Bengali accent. She always wore soft cotton saris and had a melodious voice with which she sang Indian movie songs, and this she did in a lower octave than those sung by the original singer. The mellowness of her voice succeeded in enhancing the quality of the song. The rasgullas and other delicacies which she was adept at supplying him with must have contributed to the prominence of his abdomen, yet the paucity of fat on the rest of his body defied explanation. There were also the railway doctors who came and went after Dr. Udham Singh retired. Dr. Hansraj, whose daughter Maya was a friend of ours for a while, and then a Dr. Verma, whose son Raja went to Kingswood School. Raja was short, dark-skinned, and had a plain face with no striking features, yet he had an air of superiority toward us other children, but then to be given a name like Raja must have had some impact on his ego. I wonder if the names we are given affect us and identify us more so to ourselves than to others. There was also a Dr. Dewanji, another Bengali doctor, who took up residence in Kalor and practiced out of his own home. He was small-made, light-skinned, and walked with a rigid gait, with his head slightly tilted to one side, so that it appeared that he had cocked his head over and was straining to hear some invisible person by his shoulder. He had a unique method of administering injections, which he did by standing a few feet away and shooting the needle like a dart through the fully clothed hip of the patient. Chapter 41. The street that ran past the front of our house met the main road that stretched all the way in a straight line from the marketplace to just past the football field. Here it forked into three roads, the one on the left leading to the railway station, the one on the right leading up the hill to Kingswood School, and another still on the right, below it, curving along the base of the hill leading to St. Agnes's Convent. There were shortcuts everywhere, which we regularly took, especially the one that took us past the tennis court at the base of the hillock, where we used to sit and watch Papaji playing tennis, while we sat under the oak tree where the acorns descended without any prompting, unlike the walnuts in Narangi Bagicha. We scooped out the insides of acorns to make whistles, blowing into the hollows which then emitted a sad, plaintive sound, as if they had acquired the anguish of the two young lovers who had taken their lives beneath the tree. The couple's union had been thwarted by their parents, so believing that they would be reincarnated in their next lives in a way that would allow no obstacles to their togetherness, they put their arms around each other and swallowed the poison. As I blew into the whistle, I wondered if they had turned into acorns by some mistake, unlike the story about the two lovers beside Inya Lake who had drunk the potion that ended their human existence and had instantly morphed into two trees with their branches extended like arms wrapped about each other. The Burmese government school stood on one side of the street, the apex of its triangular compound tapering toward a point at the main road. It was at this corner where the lady squatted on a small stool, displaying a few tasty snacks on large bamboo trays set on a low wooden table. Our favorite, that is my sister Dolly's and mine, was buying zio zidi, made from a kind of plum cooked in jaggery and spiced with chili powder and served on a banana leaf. The other treat we enjoyed was bazaindi, crab apples, which were blanched in salted water, the stem end of the apple scooped out and filled with chili and salt. This was then laid out in the sun for a few days so that it remained juicy but got tinged with shades of russet, pink, and yellow, retaining a certain sun-kissed flavor. We would bite off a piece and dip it into the chili pot on top, relishing the taste while we wandered on to school in the morning. While walking by myself to school one day, I came across a lady walking in the opposite direction who was carrying a basket on her head. She wore typical Burmese dress, a white cotton angie, and below this she wore a brightly colored longi. As we drew close, she suddenly stopped in her tracks and, to my astonishment, placing her feet apart, peed into the dry earth of the pathway, which soaked it up into a dark patch, splattering and scattering tiny dust balls around the edges. Her longi had remained in place throughout the exercise. Occasionally, a bullock cart would trundle along past us on the road, and a bull would nonchalantly drop a blob of dung, permeating the air with the scent of fresh manure. The automobile remained a novelty, because in spite of the war, the frenzied pace of tomorrows in a world gone awry was not yet upon us. In fact, the war had slowed down and set back the speed with which we had been moving forward. Chapter 42. It was some time in April, not long after we returned to Kolor, that my father had scheduled a business trip to Mektila, and we, younger ones, scrambled into the jeep to accompany him. It grew warmer as we continued on our dusty ride toward our destination. Just as we were about to enter the town, we stopped for a short while under a banyan tree which stood with its leafy branches extending in all directions from the wide trunk. Beneath the tree was a reddish-brown clay chatty, filled with cool water, and covering the wide circular mouth of the large vessel was a matching lid of clay with a blue-rimmed, white enamel mug placed upside down on it. The chatty stood on a bamboo platform not more than 2 feet wide and was supported by stilts that brought it up to a convenient height for anyone who might stand beside it. It had a little roof of thatch above it, to supplement the shade already supplied by the tree. In the shimmering heat of the sun, where even the shade was warm, it offered a gift to the thirsty traveler and a kudo for the benefactor. Here a person was expected to drink the water without letting the mug touch his lips. My father said, "Do you see that water chatty there?" "Yes, Papaji," I said. "Do you understand the full significance of it?" "What do you mean?" I said. "What does it say to you?" my father said. "You can drink the water," I replied. "Yes, that's true," my father said. "But this is a giving, a true kind of giving, where the receiver doesn't know who has given it, and the person who's giving it doesn't know who's receiving it, and whether it will be the one person or many. He doesn't hear your gratitude or ingratitude. His reward comes from a different source, and also from the joy of having had the ability to give." This was my first brush with Buddha's philosophy, and as the sunlight glanced off the leaves, leaving a pattern of gray on the yellow dusty soil, the breeze rested. I tasted the water. It felt cool in my mouth and tasted sweet on my tongue. There was a hum of silence here, a whispered quiet that hung suspended in the warm air of the shade, which stilled my heart and tumbled my mind to a point beyond thought. That moment captured sits in my center and holds me safe through the tangle and the inevitable vicissitudes of life. A few years later, climbing to the top of Mylung town, the hill that towered above the railway station, I would seek and find that same peace, sitting in the shade of a tree by the pagoda that had been built on its apex, and listening to the silence broken only by a soft breeze teasing the tea bells. And I thought about the gentle Buddha and his teachings, how in Burma they nearly lost the true meaning of his philosophy when the Ari monks sought to corrupt it with barbarism and primitive rituals. They created a hierarchy with themselves at the top and women at the lowest level, and all those who did not belong to the monastic order were made to prostrate in their presence. They chose to forget that the Buddha himself never elevated himself, and that he preached humility as one of the most important characteristics to develop. The Ari also brought in the slaughter of animals as sacrifice and reintroduced the worship of nuts. I thought of how King Anuruddha must have struggled to overcome the evil forces, especially when they were being applied by people in positions of authority and trust, religious leaders who had under their control the very soul of the people. But he succeeded somehow to remove the Ari and bring in a purer form of the faith, which was Theravada Buddhism. In doing so, however, he had to compromise so that remnants of ancient Hindu and animist customs and some of the Ari traditions remained embedded in the revived religion like a virus that remains dormant for years and then returns with a vengeance in a weakened immune system. Fast forward to 2013, and in the very town where I first touched the hem of this gentle faith, the force of evil raised its ugly head. It started, they say, with an altercation in a jewelry shop, but the immune system of the country had been compromised for more than half a century, and the disease of anger heightened itself to fever pitch in a mob, which found its target in the vulnerable but tangible small minority of Muslims in Maktila. Acts of degradation, murder, and arson were unleashed upon innocent children and adults as a toxic contagion leapt from person to person, an uncontrollable wildfire ignited like the fire triangle of firefighters the existence of all the necessary preconditions. History has shown innumerable times that when people are defenseless and the true enemy cannot be defeated, people turn on each other like rats trapped in a cage for too long and attack first of all the weaker ones. Driven on by a heady sense of power, those who have a defiled Bhagavana Chitta, that is, a defiled subconscious or a defiled state of mind, spur on the madness that prevails. Yet, my faith is deep and strong in the resilience and true spirituality of the people, as was demonstrated in one instance of many. Sakina had washed and put away the cooking pots and was about to put her young son to sleep for his afternoon nap when she heard the voices of what seemed to be a crowd of people approaching her little house by the mosque. With a sudden sense of dread, she stepped out of the door and saw a crowd of people gathered outside the madrasa adjacent to her dwelling. As she clutched her child to her bosom, her heart pounded against her ribs with fear and then horror as she witnessed young boys and adult men from the school being hauled out and violently beaten with wooden clubs. As they fell under the blows, they were dragged into the center of the mob and piled up one on top of the other. She saw her brother and then her husband trying to run from the grasp of the mob, but the grip of several hands with murderous intent made their efforts to escape futile. Blows rained down upon them, and as they were flung into the pile of battered yet living bodies, kerosene was poured over them and ignited. Then, as she stood petrified, someone in the mob noticed her presence and, drawing the attention of the others to her, turned on her and began beating her severely while she struggled to still hold on to her son. As the child fell from her arms, a Buddhist woman rushed in and, grabbing the child, took him to safety. Sakina was beginning to lose consciousness when the police arrived and picked her up with several other women who had received similar treatment. The carnage continued, and as they were being loaded onto the truck, one of the young men raced toward them and attempted to get onto the slowly moving vehicle. He had almost succeeded in clambering over the back when he was quickly grabbed by the mob. His vain cries of protest grew fainter and then stopped altogether as he was pulled away and thrown onto the fire. Those who had made it into the vehicle were taken to the police station, where they were cautioned to remain very quiet and wait while the police went back to rescue others. There were also instances where Ponjis, who had a deeper understanding of their faith and actually put it into practice, sheltered Muslims from the rampage, as did several Buddhists and students in Mandalay who organized a rescue mission. But in Maktila, the tea bells still chimed softly on the pagodas, their silvery sounds escaping on the wind and merging with the raging expletives of the mob and the wailing of the victims. Chapter 43. There were many puers held around Kalor. These were like fairs, but with a religious basis, celebrating a particular na, or spirit, or an auspicious Buddhist occasion. Each festival coincided with a full moon and began toward the end of October. No more rain was expected till May of the following year, so throughout this period there were many puers one could attend. We looked forward to the trips we sometimes took with our father to the puer in Aungban. This was usually held during a time of year when one could venture for miles without fear of getting drenched or having to slosh around in wet shoes through slush and muddy puddles. We watched giant rice paper balloons gloriously drift up into the sky from the Ponjichang and catch fire before descending back to earth in a little pile of ash, like the symbol of the transience of this existence in Buddhist philosophy. Colored cellophane paper lanterns, yellow, red, green, and blue, were made in so simple a design that we were able to make our own, and once the candle in the middle was lit, created pretty patterns of light. Firecrackers and sparklers suddenly appeared, and when they were set off, left the smell of burnt gunpowder in the air, which mixed in with the scent of oranges and roasting peanuts. Delicacies like sticky rice in bamboo tubes, mung le sao, shan tofu, pyo to, jindo, and a host of other snacks were sold by vendors who came in from the hills around. It was a special treat to be taken to the puer, something my mother frowned upon and to which she never accompanied us. It was always after dark that the event started and then continued for a few days. Only a few stalls remained open during the day as most of the performers and vendors slept, making up for lost sleep of the previous night, so all the fun things happened after dusk. There is a special excitement about going out at night, almost like partaking in a forbidden pleasure, and it was particularly so that night when we went to the puer. The air was crisp and cool. The chill of winter had not yet set in when we excitedly clambered into the jeep. The moon had just risen in the sky and was shedding enough light to show up the milestones along the road at every furlong. Sitting on the hard metal benches on either side of the jeep, we held onto the crossbars, and though the open car moved slowly, there was sufficient momentum to create a wind that blew against my face, drying my eyes and making them sting. About 2 miles out of Kalor, the two guardian chindays of the village of Sher Basti loomed up on our left and slipped by. This was the village where Madhai and her son Ram Lakhan lived. They were so authentically Desi that whenever I heard of Indian villagers, I visualized these two folks. They often visited my mother, sometimes bringing koya, which my mother paid them for, and experimented with trying to make the sweetmeat burfi. They would come into the house, sit on the floor in the living room, and chat with my mother. Madhai was a widow, I assumed, because her husband never accompanied her, and she invariably wore a white sari. Heavy silver bracelets ornamented her forearms, while a heavy silver necklace graced her neck. She smelt of cows and earth and had the hard-earned, weathered face of a woman who had toiled all her life, tilling the soil, planting, harvesting, and milking cows, apart from her other regular household chores. Her son Ram Lakhan wore a dhoti rather than a longi or pants, and wore a simple turban of white cotton on his head. He was then in his early 30s, and she herself was probably in her late 40s, which indicated to me that she must have been married off when very young. With her son, now an adult, and having survived the loss of her husband and the war that followed, there was a little less need for too much hard work, and she could have found some peace, but by some quirk of fate, she developed a malady that filled her with dread. The first occasion I witnessed her newly developed madness was when she and her son visited us, and she suddenly, looking terrified, crawled in and hid under the dining table, claiming that the ceiling was caving in on her head. That night, as we drove toward the puer past their village, I wasn't thinking of Madhai or Ram Lakhan. I was preoccupied with looking into the forest, which looked menacing on either side of the road. The sense of fear I felt was mingled with anticipated adventure and the excitement of the possibility of dangerous dacoits suddenly appearing. The 7-mile trip to Angban was long. Distances were so much greater then. The half hour it took expanded itself somehow as we watched each furlong marked off in short, lime-coated, rectangular posts that looked like giant pieces of blackboard chalk. I knew we were almost there when I heard the faint sound of xylophones, and then as we got closer, I smelled the scent of roasting peanuts mingled with that of freshly peeled oranges, and then I heard the excited voices of people and the calls of the men and women who manned the gambling tables. Here the open-air stalls, constructed on dirt floors, were occupied by simple tables manned by single individuals, either male or female. On the table was a large shiny white oilcloth marked out into 6 squares with black lines. In each square was the picture of an animal or bird, more often than not a rabbit, a snake, a frog, a peacock, a turtle, and a rooster. Some of the tables had only 3 sections and just 3 creatures. Large dice with miniaturized painted copies of the creatures on the board were rattled in ornately decorated lacquered containers and then rolled onto the cloth. This was followed by the delighted or dismayed voices of those who had deposited their coins on their respective choice of animal or bird and had either won or lost. Pentatonic music of xylophones, drums, and cymbals resounded in our ears as we approached the front of the stage, which was colorfully decorated with carved wood painted red and gold. Heavy velvet curtains formed the backdrop, and on the brightly lit stage itself, the performing Minda and Mindami exchanged a dialogue in song. The actors used many gestures with dance-like movements performed to the beat of the music, demonstrating immense flexibility, squatting down on their haunches and then leaping up while their hands arched backwards in sharp, jerking movements like marionettes on strings. Their headgear appeared to be made of intricately designed silver, which seemed to be encrusted with many precious stones. Attired in pastel shades of pink and green silk longies, which extended beyond their feet, but with a slit on the sides to permit ease of movement, it was still surprising how they danced with so much agility without tripping. The edge of the top half of the garment had wing-like projections that curved up and outwards, similar to the upturned eaves of the Mandalay Palace, which I had seen in a picture. The audience sat on finely woven bamboo mats laid out on the ground and appeared to be spellbound at the performance. The Minda probably improvised over and above the rehearsed script with impromptu jokes, at which the spectators slapped their thighs and laughed uproariously, while the cymbals clashed loudly to emphasize the punchline. Then softer notes were struck on the xylophone, and sometimes the Burmese harp would bring in a romantic scene or a tragic turn of events, stirring strange emotions in me, even though I hadn't understood many of the words. Catching the mood of the audience, I would feel a euphoric surge or find myself on the verge of tears. Chapter 44. The moonlight caught the window panes and filtered in through the mosquito net, casting uneven squares of shadow and light onto my bed. My brothers and sisters lay asleep in the large dormitory-type bedroom, where the dividing wall separating the boys' section from the girls had been removed during the renovations after the bombs fell, and also knocked down one side of the house. It was easy for me to fall off to sleep most nights because I had invented a way of making sure I dreamt about what I wanted by spinning an imaginary wheel. Into each segment of the wheel, I would visualize images of things I liked, such as butterflies and flowers, or a doll's tea set that I would like to have, or a sky with double and triple rainbows. I would select one of them, and when I awoke in the morning, I was sure I had dreamt the dream of my choice. My favorite dream was the one where I flew up into the night sky, collected the stars in my cupped hands, and brought them home. As I lay in my bed one night, I looked up at the ceiling of the mosquito net and in a moment of pareidolia, saw the faint shadows in the fabric form faces which stared down at me. Frightened, I call in a whisper, Papaji, Papaji. I wonder if he will hear me if I call again, even more softly, Papaji, Papaji. I whisper over and over again, even more softly. He somehow hears me from their bedroom. Dar lagta, I'm afraid, I say. He sits on my bed and says, Paro, Kulauzu bi Rabbil Falak. Say, I seek refuge in the Lord of daybreak, from the evil of that which has been created, from the evil of the darkness when it is intense, from the evil of malignant witchcraft, and from the evil of the envier when he envies. I start repeating the prayer in Arabic after him and fall asleep halfway through the prayer. One morning, shortly after we had returned to Cologne after the war and had just been enrolled in the convent for the first time, we had not yet acquired the convenience of the jeep, so we walked along the red clay of the footpath to school. The rain that had fallen earlier in vertical beaded glass curtains had now stopped. As we came to the shortcut on the other side of the hillock by the tennis court, the pathway was deeply entrenched with waterlogged footprints of various sizes, each reflecting the sky like so many misshapen mirrors of light. In a spurt of urgent growth, life surged in the grasses, the shrubs, and the trees, and in the puddles, tiny tadpoles with oversized heads and wagging tails mysteriously appeared overnight. The wet, fresh scent of the air rose from the newly bathed earth in a vapor, and I inhaled deeply, held it a second longer than I needed to before exhaling, as if I wanted to breathe in that moment and never let it go. A branch had broken off a tree and had been whipped directly onto the path, and a tangle of twigs stuck out asymmetrically from it in all directions. Papaji picked it up and moved it out of the way to prevent us from tripping over it.